My name is Rashid Ahmed. I'm 28 years old. And on November 15th, 2023, I led what I thought was a righteous protest inside St. Michael's Cathedral in Birmingham, England. I had no idea that in less than 30 minutes, I would experience something that would shatter everything I believed about God, power, and truth. I was born in Bradford, West Yorkshire, to a family deeply committed to Islamic activism. My father, Khalid, wasn't just a businessman. He was a community organizer who had spent decades fighting for Muslim rights in Britain. My mother, Yasmin, ran educational programs teaching young Muslims how to defend their faith in what she called an increasingly hostile society. From my earliest memories, our dinner table conversations revolved around strategy, resistance, and the importance of never backing down when Islam was challenged. While other British Pakistani kids were playing football or obsessing over video games, I was attending community meetings and learning how to organize protests. By age 14, I had already participated in dozens of demonstrations against foreign policy, against media representation of Muslims, against what we perceived as systemic Islamophobia in British institutions. My parents were proud of my commitment. The community elders would nod approvingly when they saw me, calling me a young lion defending the faith. Ask yourself this question. Have you ever been so convinced of your righteousness that opposition felt like confirmation you were doing something important? That was my entire identity. I studied political science at the University of Leeds, but my real education happened in activism circles. I learned media strategy, how to frame narratives, how to mobilize crowds, and most importantly, how to identify and challenge what we saw as attacks on Islam. I wasn't violent. I prided myself on being sophisticated, articulate, and strategic. I believed I was fighting the good fight using intelligence rather than aggression. By 2023, I had become a prominent voice in British Muslim activism. I had over 47,000 followers on social media where I posted daily content about defending Islamic values, challenging Christian missionary activity, and exposing what I called the hypocrisy of Western secularism. My videos regularly got thousands of views, and I received messages constantly from young Muslims telling me I inspired them to stand up for their faith. The incident that led to November 15th started 3 weeks earlier. St. Michael's Cathedral in Birmingham had begun hosting weekly Alpha Course sessions, Christian introduction classes that were specifically marketed towards people from other faiths, including Muslims. The advertising materials explicitly mention helping Muslims discover the truth about Jesus. To me and my activist network, this was aggressive proselytizing targeting vulnerable Muslim immigrants in our community. We organized several meetings to discuss how to respond. Some suggested peaceful dialogue with church leadership. Others wanted to file complaints with local authorities about religious harassment. But I argued for something bolder, a direct action that would send an unmistakable message that Muslims would not tolerate organized missionary activity in our neighborhoods. I proposed we disrupt their Sunday service to show them how it felt when someone invaded your sacred space. On November 12th, I posted a carefully worded video on social media explaining our planned action. I framed it as civil disobedience against cultural imperialism, comparing it to historical protests against injustice. I emphasized we would be peaceful but firm, that we would simply make our presence known during their service and distribute literature explaining why Christian missionary activity toward Muslims was offensive and harmful. The video was shared thousands of times within 48 hours. I recruited 7 other activists for the action: Tariq, Imran, Zainab, Fatima, Hassan, Bilal, and Nasreen. All of them were university educated, articulate, and committed to what we saw as defending our community. We met at my apartment the night before to finalize our plan. We would enter during the communion service, stand in the aisles, and read prepared statements about religious respect and the harm of proselytizing. We would record everything on our phones to document the church's reaction and show the world how Christians responded when confronted with the same tactics they used against Muslims. That evening we prayed together, asking Allah to give us courage and protect us during our action. I felt spiritually energized, convinced we were doing something that would please God and defend His religion. I had memorized my statement perfectly, a 3-minute speech about religious dignity, mutual respect, and the arrogance of assuming other faiths needed to be saved by Christianity. November 15th, 2023 started like any revolutionary day in history must have started, with absolute certainty about the righteousness of our cause. We arrived at St. Michael's Cathedral at 10:47 a.m., timing our entrance for what we knew would be the communion portion of their 10:30 service. The cathedral was a beautiful old stone building over 150 years old, with stained glass windows and Gothic architecture that reminded everyone of Britain's Christian heritage. We entered quietly through the main doors. The service was in progress with approximately 200 people in attendance. An elderly priest was at the altar preparing communion elements while the congregation sang a hymn. We walked purposefully down the center aisle, our phones recording everything. I could see people's faces turning toward us with confusion and then concern as they realized something unusual was happening. We positioned ourselves strategically, 4 of us in the center aisle, 2 near the sides, and 2 near the communion table itself. The singing faltered and stopped. The priest looked up from his preparations, his expression showing surprise but not fear. He was an older man, perhaps 70, with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor that momentarily made me question what we were doing. But I pushed that doubt aside. This was the moment. I raised my phone higher to ensure good footage and prepared to read my statement. Zainab and Fatima had already begun unfurling a banner that read, "Stop Islamophobic Proselytizing." The congregation sat frozen, unsure how to respond to our intrusion into their sacred ritual. I opened my mouth to speak, ready to deliver the words I had practiced 100 times. This was going to be our moment of victory, the day we showed that Muslims would not passively accept missionary activity in their communities. I had no idea I was about to experience something that would make me question everything I had ever believed about spiritual power and the nature of God Himself. Ask yourself this question: what happens when absolute certainty collides with impossible reality? The moment I opened my mouth to read my prepared statement, something happened that had no rational explanation. My jaw locked, not gradually, not like a muscle cramp, but instantly and completely, as if my entire mouth had been sealed shut by an invisible force. I tried to force words out, but my lips wouldn't move, my tongue wouldn't respond, and no sound emerged except a muffled grunt of confusion. I looked at Tariq beside me, planning to signal him to start speaking instead, but his eyes were wide with the same panic I was feeling. His mouth was opening and closing like a fish out of water, but no sound was coming out. Across the aisle, I could see Imran experiencing the same thing, silent, confused, and increasingly frightened. Then, the physical immobilization spread. My legs, which had been firmly planted on the cathedral floor, suddenly felt like they had been fused to the stone beneath my feet. I tried to lift my right foot, then my left, but neither would budge. It wasn't like being stuck in mud or held down by physical restraints. My legs simply would not obey my brain's commands to move. The sensation was terrifying because I could feel everything normally: temperature, pressure, sensation, but control had been completely removed. Ask yourself this question: have you ever experienced your body refusing to obey your mind's commands while you remained fully conscious? I watched the same realization dawn on every one of my fellow activists. Zainab's hands were frozen mid-air, still holding the banner that now hung limply because she couldn't adjust her grip. Fatima's phone had stopped recording because her finger was locked on the screen, unable to swipe or tap. Hassan had been mid-step when the immobilization occurred, and he was now stuck in an awkward, half-balanced position that should have been physically impossible to maintain. The congregation watched in stunned silence. Some people stood up from their PWs, uncertain whether this was some kind of performance art or a genuine medical emergency. A few people pulled out their phones and began recording us. The activists who came to document a protest were now being documented in our mysterious paralysis. The elderly priest, Father Thomas Bennett, walked slowly down from the altar toward where we stood, frozen in the aisle. His expression was not triumphant or angry, but filled with what looked like sadness mixed with compassion. He approached me first, stopping about 3 feet away, close enough that I could see the deep lines around his eyes and the silver cross hanging from his neck. "Young man," he said gently, "do you understand what's happening to you?" His voice was kind, but carried an authority that made my heart race even faster. I wanted to respond, to argue, to defend our actions, but my mouth remained sealed shut. I could only stare at him with what must have been obvious terror in my eyes. Father Thomas turned to address the congregation, his voice calm and measured. "Brothers and sisters, we are witnessing something that should remind us all of God's sovereignty. These young people came here intending to disrupt our worship and mock our sacred communion. But God has chosen to reveal His power in a way that protects His house and His people." He looked back at us, and I saw tears forming in his eyes. "This is not punishment," he continued. "This is mercy. God is showing you that He is real, that this is not just human tradition or cultural heritage, but the very presence of the living God whom you have chosen to challenge." The immobilization lasted exactly 17 minutes, though it felt like hours. During that time, I experienced something I had never felt in all my years of Islamic devotion: the overwhelming awareness of being in the presence of genuine divine power that was not on my side. Every prayer I had prayed, every verse I had memorized, every act of religious devotion suddenly felt hollow compared to the raw reality of what was happening to my physical body. I tried to pray to Allah for help, to ask Him to break whatever curse or trick was being used against us. But even my internal prayers felt like they were bouncing off some invisible barrier, going nowhere, finding no audience. For the first time in my life, I questioned whether the God I had been serving actually had the power I had always assumed He possessed. Around me, I could see my fellow activists experiencing their own private terror. Nasreen had tears streaming down her face, though she couldn't move her hands to wipe them away. Bilal's eyes were darting frantically from side to side, the only part of his body that still responded to his will. Imran had gone pale, his breathing rapid and shallow as panic set in. Several congregation members approached us cautiously, not with hostility but with genuine concern. A middle-aged woman touched Zainab's shoulder gently and asked if she was okay. An older man offered Tariq water, though Tariq couldn't open his mouth to drink it. The kindness in their response was almost worse than anger would have been. It highlighted how wrong we had been about these people. Father Thomas returned to the altar and made an announcement that shocked everyone, including the congregation. "We are going to continue with communion," he said. "The young people came to disrupt this sacred meal, but I believe God wants us to show them what it truly means. I am inviting them, if they are able and willing, to receive communion with us." The moment he spoke those words, I felt the immobilization begin to lift. First, my jaw loosened, allowing me to gasp in deep breaths. Then my legs gained the ability to move again, though they were shaking so badly I nearly collapsed. Around me, my fellow activists were experiencing the same gradual release from whatever force had been holding us. Tariq immediately turned toward the door, clearly intending to run from the cathedral. But after taking 2 steps, he stopped and turned back, his face showing the same confusion I felt. We could leave, physically. We now had the ability to walk out. But something was compelling us to stay, not through physical force, but through an inexplicable pull that was even stronger than the fear. I looked at the communion table, at the bread and wine that represented what Christians believed was Jesus Christ's body and blood. Everything in my Islamic training screamed that I should reject this, that participating in Christian communion would be the ultimate betrayal of my faith. But everything I had just experienced told me that there was power here I had never encountered in any mosque, any prayer, or any religious experience of my entire life. Father Thomas stood waiting at the altar, his hands extended in invitation. "You are welcome," he said simply, "not because you deserve it, but because grace is never about deserving. Jesus offers himself even to those who came here to disrupt his worship. Ask yourself this question: what do you do when the God you thought you were fighting against proves he has power your own God never demonstrated?" I took the first step toward the altar, my legs still trembling from the experience of forced immobilization. I wasn't making a faith decision in that moment. I was responding to raw, undeniable reality. Whatever power had frozen us in place was inviting us forward, and refusing that invitation felt more dangerous than accepting it. Behind me, I heard the hesitant footsteps of my fellow activists following. The walk down that aisle felt longer than any journey I had ever taken. Every step was a betrayal of my family, my community, and everything I had been taught about defending Islam against Christian influence. But every step was also an acknowledgement that I had just encountered something that shattered my understanding of spiritual reality. The God I came to challenge had demonstrated power in a way that Allah had never manifested in my entire life of devotion. Father Thomas watched us approach with an expression I couldn't initially understand. It wasn't triumph or vindication, but something closer to heartbreak mixed with hope. When I reached the front of the line, he looked directly into my eyes with an intensity that made me want to look away. "Do you understand what you're receiving?" he asked quietly, his voice meant only for me. I shook my head honestly. I had studied Christian theology from an Islamic apologetics perspective, learning how to refute Christian beliefs about Jesus' divinity and the crucifixion, but I had never tried to understand what Christians actually experienced in their faith. Right now, I understood nothing except that I had been completely wrong about the power dynamics I thought existed between Islam and Christianity. This bread represents Jesus Christ's body, broken for the forgiveness of sins. Father Thomas explained, holding up a small piece of unleavened bread. This wine represents his blood, shed so that anyone, regardless of their past, their religion, or their actions, can be reconciled to God. The only requirement is that you acknowledge your need for Him. Ask yourself this question: have you ever been in a position where pride and truth were in direct conflict, and choosing truth meant destroying your entire identity? That's exactly where I stood. Taking communion meant admitting that Jesus Christ had power over my body, over physical reality, and possibly over my eternal soul. It meant acknowledging that everything I had built my life around, my activism, my religious identity, my sense of purpose, was fundamentally opposed to something far more powerful and real than I had imagined. I opened my mouth and received the bread. The moment it touched my tongue, I felt a warmth spread through my chest that had nothing to do with physical temperature. It was like something that had been frozen inside me for years was suddenly beginning to thaw. Father Thomas offered me the wine, and I drank, tasting the bitter sweetness while my mind raced with implications I wasn't ready to process. Behind me, one by one, my fellow activists received communion. Some were crying openly. Tariq's hands were shaking so badly that Father Thomas had to steady the cup for him. Zainab whispered something that sounded like "I'm sorry" as she received the bread. Even Imran, who had been the most hardline among us, took communion with tears streaming down his face. When all 8 of us had participated in the ritual we came to disrupt, Father Thomas invited us to sit in the front pew. The congregation continued their service, but I couldn't focus on anything except the war happening inside my mind and heart. Everything I thought I knew about God, power, truth, and reality was being challenged simultaneously. After the service concluded, Father Thomas asked if we would be willing to stay and talk. The congregation filed out, many of them looking at us with expressions of concern rather than anger. One older woman even paused to touch my shoulder and whisper, "God loves you, dear. Never forget that." In the small meeting room behind the sanctuary, Father Thomas sat across from our group of thoroughly shaken activists. For several minutes, no one spoke. "What do you say after experiencing something that shouldn't be possible according to your understanding of reality?" Finally, Nasreen broke the silence. "What happened to us?" Her voice was small, almost childlike, completely different from the confident activist who had entered the cathedral an hour earlier. Father Thomas leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "You encountered the living God," he said simply. "Not as a theological concept or religious tradition, but as a real, powerful, personal being who responds when his worship is threatened. What you experienced wasn't magic or psychological manipulation. It was God Himself protecting His house and His people, while simultaneously inviting you into relationship with Him." "But we're Muslims," Hassan protested weakly. "Allah is supposed to be the most powerful, the only true God. How could the Christian God have power over us?" The priest's expression was compassionate but firm. "That's the question you came here to avoid, but God made you face it anyway. If Allah were truly all-powerful, wouldn't He have protected you from what happened? Wouldn't He have empowered you to complete your mission? Instead, you discovered that the God you came to challenge had the power to stop you completely." I felt anger rising in my chest, the familiar defensive anger that had always protected me when Christian theology challenged my Islamic beliefs. But this time, the anger felt hollow, because it was trying to deny what I had just physically experienced. I couldn't argue with the reality of what had happened to my body. "So, what are you saying?" I asked, my voice harsher than I intended. "That we should just abandon Islam and become Christians because of one weird experience." Father Thomas shook his head. "I'm not asking you to do anything in this moment, except be honest about what you experienced. You came here believing you had truth and power on your side. You came to disrupt our worship and demonstrate Muslim strength. What actually happened? Be honest." The silence that followed was heavy. None of us wanted to voice what we all knew, that we had been completely powerless, that our religious certainty had offered no protection, that the God we thought we were defending had been absent, while the God we came to challenge had manifested with undeniable power. Fatima spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never felt Allah's presence the way I felt something in that cathedral. In the mosque, I feel peace and community. But I've never experienced anything that felt like actual divine power until today." Her words articulated what I had been afraid to admit even to myself. In all my years of Islamic devotion, the prayers, the fasting, the Quran memorization, the activism, I had experienced religious feelings, but never anything that felt like actual contact with supernatural power. Today, I had encountered something that transcended religious feeling and entered the realm of objective reality. Father Thomas gave us his contact information and invited us to return anytime we wanted to talk more. "This is not about winning an argument or converting you to a religion," he said as we prepared to leave. "This is about truth. What you experienced today was true, whether you accept it or not. The question is what you will do with that truth." As we walked out of St. Michael's Cathedral into the grey Birmingham afternoon, not one of us spoke. We had entered as confident activists ready to make a statement. We left as confused, frightened people who had experienced something that challenged everything we built our lives around. I pulled out my phone to check social media, where I had expected to see our protest video going viral and generating support for our cause. Instead, I saw dozens of videos posted by congregation members showing 8 Muslim activists frozen in place, unable to move or speak, looking terrified in the middle of a Christian church. The comments were already spreading rapidly, some mocking us, some praising God, some demanding scientific explanations. My phone buzzed with a call from my father. I stared at his name on the screen, knowing exactly what that conversation would entail. He had seen the videos. The community had seen the videos. Everyone would want an explanation for why we had failed so spectacularly and why we had then participated in Christian communion. Ask yourself this question. What do you do when the evidence of your experience contradicts everything your community believes and expects from you? The backlash from the Muslim community was immediate and severe. By the evening of November 15th, I had received over 300 messages ranging from concern to outrage to outright threats. My father called me 6 times before I finally answered, and his disappointment cut deeper than any anger could have. "You took communion?" he said, his voice breaking. "You participated in their shirk? Have you lost your mind, Rashid?" I tried to explain what happened, the immobilization, the undeniable power, the sense of encountering something real and terrifying. But my words sounded weak even to my own ears. How do you convince someone of an experience they didn't share? My father's final words before hanging up were, "You need to make a public recantation and reaffirm your Islam, or you are no longer my son." The other activists and I met at a neutral location the next day, all of us struggling with the same crisis. Tariq wanted to explain away what happened as mass hysteria or some kind of psychological manipulation. Churches used sound frequencies and lighting tricks. He insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. We just need to research what techniques they used on us. But Nasreen pushed back. Research what? The fact that we literally couldn't move our bodies, that our mouths were sealed shut. I've looked into every scientific explanation, and none of them fit what we experienced. She pulled out her laptop and showed us articles about conversion disorder, hypnosis, and crowd psychology. None of these explain how 8 people simultaneously lost physical control in the exact same way at the exact same moment. Over the following weeks, I found myself doing something I had never done before, actually reading the Bible with an open mind instead of mining it for arguments to refute Christianity. I started with the Gospel of John, and by the 3rd chapter, I encountered the verse that would haunt me. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. The contrast with Islamic theology was staggering. Islam taught me that Allah demands submission, obedience, and perfect adherence to law. But Christianity taught that God sacrifices himself for humanity's redemption. One was about humanity reaching up to earn God's favor. The other was about God reaching down to offer unearned grace. Ask yourself this question. What if everything you were taught about God was backwards, not completely false, but fundamentally missing the most important truth? I began meeting secretly with Father Thomas, usually late at night when no one from my community would see me entering the cathedral. These weren't aggressive evangelism sessions or pressure to convert. Instead, Father Thomas patiently answered my questions about Christian theology, the nature of Jesus, the meaning of the cross, and why God would manifest power to stop our protest. God didn't humiliate you to punish you, Father Thomas explained during one of our meetings. He intervened to protect his people and to get your attention. You were so convinced of your own righteousness that only something dramatic could break through your certainty. What happened in that cathedral was actually God's mercy toward you. 3 months after the incident, on February 12, 2024, I made the decision that cost me everything but gave me what I had been searching for my entire life. I surrendered my life to Jesus Christ, not because I was convinced by arguments or coerced by circumstances, but because I had encountered undeniable truth and could no longer live in denial of what I experienced. The cost was exactly what I expected. My father officially disowned me. My mother refused to speak to me. My activist networks expelled me and branded me a traitor. Friends I had known since childhood blocked me on social media and warned others to avoid me. I lost my job at a Muslim community center where I had worked part-time. My apartment lease wasn't renewed because the landlord didn't want an apostate in his building. But what I gained made every loss worthwhile. For the first time in my life, I experienced peace that wasn't dependent on my performance or religious achievements. I understood grace, not as a theological concept, but as lived reality. I discovered that God's love wasn't something I had to earn through activism or perfect observance, but something freely given that I could simply receive. 4 of my 7 fellow activists eventually followed me into Christian faith over the following year. Nasreen, Imran, Bilal, and Fatima all had their own journeys of wrestling with what we experienced, researching alternative explanations, and finally admitting that we had encountered the living God that day in St. Michael's Cathedral. The other three, Tariq, Zainab, and Hassan, returned to Islam and have not spoken to any of us since. On November 15th, 2024, exactly 1 year after the incident, I stood at the same altar in St. Michael's Cathedral where I had first received communion. But this time I was being baptized as a public declaration of my faith in Jesus Christ. Father Thomas performed the baptism, and over 150 people attended, including several dozen Muslims who had been following my journey and were curious about what could transform someone so dramatically. I now work as an outreach coordinator at St. Michael's, specifically focusing on building bridges with the Muslim community, not through aggressive evangelism or confrontational tactics, but through genuine relationship and honest testimony about what I experienced. Over the past year, 17 Muslims have come to faith in Christ after hearing my story, not because I argued them into belief, but because they recognize the authenticity of transformation that only God can produce. The videos of our immobilization are still circulating online, viewed millions of times with thousands of comments debating what really happened. Skeptics claim it was staged. Muslims claim it was demonic deception. Christians claim it was divine intervention. But I know with absolute certainty what occurred that day. I encountered the power of the living God who stopped me in my tracks to save me from my own self-righteous destruction. Ask yourself this final question. What would it take for you to surrender your certainty and admit you might be wrong about the most important questions of existence? I lost my family, my community, my reputation, and my sense of identity. But I gained eternal life, perfect peace, unconditional love, and authentic purpose that transcends anything this world offers. The Muslim activist who came to disrupt communion is dead. The man who stands here now distributes that same communion to anyone hungry for the truth that transformed his life. If God can change someone like me, someone who actively opposed him and mocked his worship, then he can absolutely transform anyone willing to acknowledge the truth when they encounter it. Jesus Christ is calling you right now, just as he called me through the most dramatic intervention of my life. Don't wait for your own immobilization moment. The same God who physically stopped 8 activists in their tracks is ready to spiritually awaken you to eternal truth. All you have to do is stop running, stop defending, stop pretending you have it all figured out, and simply receive the grace he is offering freely to anyone humble enough to accept it.